Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Sports, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Paul Nepper, and today we'll be talking to Luke Eplin about his book, Our Team, The Epic Story of Four Men and the World Series That Changed Baseball. Luke, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for coming on. I wonder if you could start off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself.
I was born in rural Illinois, grew up kind of near St. Louis, have been a Cardinals fan, St. Louis Cardinals fan my whole life. I went to college at Washington University in St. Louis, got into writing, and eventually made my way out to New York, where I've worked mainly in book publishing, but have also been sort of a freelance writer on the side, which led me into this book.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how did this project come about?
It was a roundabout process. As I said, I'm from near St. Louis, and so my grandfather was a fan not of the St. Louis Cardinals, but of the St. Louis Browns. Up until the mid-'50s, St. Louis had two Major League Baseball teams, the St. Louis Cardinals, who were usually pretty good, and the St. Louis Browns, who were usually pretty terrible. And my grandfather was an odd person in that he was a diehard fan of the Browns. And so I grew up hearing more stories about the Browns than someone of my generation normally would. And anybody that knows anything about the St. Louis Browns probably knows that Bill Veeck was the last owner of the team. He did some of his most notorious stunts while he was the owner of the Browns, including bringing a little person, Eddie Goodell, to the plate. He had fans managed from the bleachers. He shut off fireworks. He did wild promotions, all of these sorts of things that we think about when we think about Bill Veeck. And so I was always entranced by him as a figure and wanted to write a book about Veeck and the Browns. And it was while I was researching Veeck's background that I focused on his earlier tenure. He was the owner of the Cleveland Indians from 1946 to 1949. So while I was researching that, I started to think that actually the most significant things Veeck did were on that team, most specifically integrating the team. And I started seeing these other figures that seemed to be of equal importance to Bill Veeck, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, Bob Feller. And I thought you could tell a really interesting alternate story of integration than the one that we normally hear, which is just completely centered on Jackie Robinson, through these four figures.
Yeah, as I said to you before we started the podcast, I mean, all four of them are really fascinating, and you did a great job of kind of, pulling them all together around the 48 Indians. Let's start with Bob Feller, who was kind of, I guess, kind of the stereotypical All-American kid. Can you talk a little bit about his background and his journey to the major leagues?
Yeah, Bob Feller, I think, has the greatest origin story for any athlete in this country's history. He was born on a farm in rural Iowa and evinced a talent for baseball from a very early age. He used to throw a lot with his father. His father sort of recognized this incredible ability in his son even before he was a teenager. And so at some point, the father cleared off a portion of his pasture and built Bob Feller sort of a diamond right there, basically in the cornfields. It was kind of the original Field of Dreams. It was also an incubator where Bob Feller was competing against people many, many years older than him and more than holding his own. Through sort of happenstance, he makes it onto the Cleveland Indians roster as a high school junior at the age of 17. And in his very first start in the majors, he ties the American League record for strikeouts. And then 4 starts later, he ties the Major League record for strikeouts. He becomes just a sensation. He's so popular that during his high school graduation the next year, it's broadcast live on the radio from coast to coast. And it's not just that he has this amazing origin story. It's that during the time whenever the Depression, this would have been 1936, is still sort of weighing on the American consciousness, Feller represents something much larger. He represents this sort of quote unquote American dream, especially for white America, where a boy can sort of come out of a rural farming community, pull himself up out of there, and just jump right to the majors and immediately begin striking people out. It's sort of an aspirational story that is characterized in this youthful figure that gave Americans comfort and hope and all these other things. And so his story becomes something that is told over and over and over again. People in the late 30s, early 40s would have had this memorized in the back of their mind. He was such a huge figure. And so his narrative takes on sort of central importance for white athletes at that time in particular.
Right. And one of the interesting parts of the book is, you describe how Feller used that narrative and the fame that came with it to or at least tried to capitalize it in the form of barnstorming, which of course is a common activity in baseball at that time. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the world of barnstorming and Feller's role in it particularly.
Well, you have to sort of think that in the popular imagination, there's this idea that farmers are sort of rural and maybe a little bit sort of, I don't want to say necessarily backwards, but maybe not as technologically advanced as, say, sort of these city folks or something like that. And that just wasn't the case with Feller. His dad had some of the most sort of cutting edge machinery of any farm in the state at that time. He was an incredible businessman, and he knew how to sort of make money, especially during the Depression. He was buying up a lot of farmland. So Bob Feller grew up in a household that was very entrepreneurially progressive. And whenever they saw the sort of fervor that was happening around Feller and all that he stood for, they took that narrative and they capitalized on it. Feller and his father never missed a trick or sort of a way to make money on it. And one of the best ways that people could make money, at least white baseball players at that time, was on the barnstorming trail. So this would have been after the major league season had concluded, so usually sort of early October, and then sort of into November, right whenever the weather turns in a lot of places. And this was because that in the 30s and 40s, and even earlier, before television, a lot of places that did not have major league teams wouldn't have been able to see these players in action. And so these sort of roving bands of players going from town to town, competing in exhibition games on these fields in cities that didn't have major league teams were a huge, huge deal. And they were also a huge deal because it allowed these players to do things that they weren't able to do during the major league season. Namely, they were playing against players from the Negro Leagues often. So you did see sort of white versus black competition during a time whenever the color line strictly prohibited that in Major League Baseball, at least. And so you had Bob Feller, who was sort of the best white pitcher in the major leagues. And one of the ways that people sort of wanted to raise more money, draw more people and all this was to pit him against who was then the sort of best and most popular pitcher in the Negro Leagues. And that would, of course, would have been Satchel Paige. So Bob Feller and Satchel Paige started hooking up and competing against each other almost immediately after Feller broke onto the national scene.
Right. I read years ago. I read Larry Tye's excellent biography of Satchel Paige, and I'd never tire of hearing stories about him. Truly one of the great characters in American sports history, I would say. You touched on a little bit, but can you talk a little more about what was Satchel Paige's stature, both in the Negro Leagues and in the baseball world in general at that time?
Well, I think one of the things I wanted to really touch on in this book was that Satchel Paige and Bob Feller were not only the best black and white pitchers respectively of their generation, but they were the most entrepreneurial-minded athletes that this country has ever seen. For as amazing as Feller was at capitalizing on his name, his story, his abilities, Satchel Paige was even better. He came of age at the turn of the last century. He was born in the Deep South during a time of extreme Jim Crow laws and sort of lynchings and all the other sort of terrors that would have been associated with that. And he managed to build himself up into the preeminent black ball player at that time. He was somebody who could sort of excite a crowd just by walking to the mound. He had a great persona. He was quick and witty in interviews. On the mound, he had an array of windups and pitches that really sort of pleased the crowd to no end. And just in terms of his ability, he had incredible control. He could put the ball wherever he wanted to. He hardly ever walked people. He was just an incredible, skilled sort of moundsman at the time. But I mean, you have to imagine Satchel Paige is doing this during the Depression when the Negro Leagues are in a state of collapse. Teams are folding left and right. The budgets are extremely small. And Satchel Paige builds himself up into a one-man franchise who barnstorms basically year-round. Whatever team sort of can pay him enough money, he will be there, while also, of course, belonging to a Negro League team as well. And so he's making about as much money as any major league superstar is at that time. And for someone to do that is just an incredible entrepreneurial feat. I mean, I think that you can draw a straight line from Satchel Paige to someone like Michael Jordan or LeBron James or something like that. I think that nobody has really matched his sort of business sense and the way that he built himself up into an attraction that not only earned a lot of money for himself, but helped him cross over into sort of the white consciousness. I mean, he was getting profiles and Time and Saturday Evening Post and all these other sort of great places during a time whenever a lot of publications just simply turned a blind eye to the Negro League. Even if you didn't know anything about the Negro League, it is probably a good bet that you knew who Satchel Paige was, or at least had heard of him.
One thing I found very interesting in the book regarding Page and Feller and the barnstorming was Feller's attitude towards black ball players in general. There was an ambivalence there. I mean, on the one hand, he was progressive in that he was obviously willing to do business with black ball players and tour with them, and he would shake their hands, and which many ball players wouldn't at that time. And yet he seemed to still embody the attitude of many at that time that they couldn't cut it in the major leagues. Can you talk a little bit about that, about Feller's feelings towards black people?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there are a lot of layers to it, and I think it's easy to just be simplistic about it. But he represents a lot of the sort of white attitude towards black ball players at that time. As you said, he was willing to not only barnstorm with them, but also to expose himself to defeat. He's pitching against Satchel Paige quite often, and Satchel Paige is pretty consistently beating him. And so it's he's not somebody who is against that, sharing the field with them or anything along those lines. And a lot of black ball players later in their lives would honor Bob Feller by saying that the sort of barnstorming that he was doing, which often was done on a grand scale, sometimes with planes and in stadiums, and drawing a lot of media attention, gave them exposure to white reporters and white executives that they otherwise might not have had. And so Feller was often invited to gatherings of Negro League players later in his life as sort of an honor. But at the same time, if he was ever asked by reporters at this time, whenever he is barnstorming, whether he thought anybody could cut it in the majors, he would hedge. And it's an interesting sort of hedge. He doesn't say, I don't think that it would work because we don't want them in the league, or it would cause racial tension, or any of these sorts of things. He says that they don't have the sort of full-on ability that you would need to make it in the major leagues. And I think that what happens with Feller is that he really buys into these sort of myths that get formed around him, that he grew up on the farm. He did all of these chores, which built up his body. He worked every day with his dad to sort of perfect his pitching. He did all these sorts of things. In other words, he pulled himself up by the bootstraps. He sort of did these things through these American values of sort of strong bonds and hard work ethic and sort of family support and all these other sorts of things. And he did it, and probably as a 17-year-old, he pulled himself into the majors. And so he's kind of looking at these black players and saying, well, if they were that good, they should be able to do that. He's sort of discounting the other barriers and prejudices that disallow them from having a similar sort of narrative as the one that he himself had. And so it's clouding his ability. He's talking about them as, well, if they were that good, they would be here. And so yeah, he has these blind spots that make him want to seek out faults in their own sort of personal makeup, rather than seeing the structural things that are preventing them from moving into the majors.
How great of a pitcher was Bob Feller?
Well, he was somebody that, in an age before radar guns, we know that he was throwing in the 100 mile an hour range, which at that time was extremely fast. He was wild, unlike Satchel Paige, and so a lot of hitters were kind of scared of him, because you could get that 100-mile-per-hour fastball and you don't know where it's going. And he was a complete workhorse. He walked a lot of people because of his wildness, and he struck out a lot of people. And so his pitch counts were tremendous, but he never really seemed to tire until later in his career. I think that if you sort of look at what he did before the war, he won over 100 games and had over 1,000 strikeouts by the age of 22. And whenever he goes into the war in 1942, he's coming off seasons where he's won like 27 and 25 games. So he is just right into his prime. You take those 4 years that he missed to the war and say that he has a baseline of 20 to 25 wins, he's retiring with a couple, at least 100 more wins and at least 1,000 more strikeouts. And I think that we would hold him in a little bit higher esteem than he perhaps is now, because his numbers don't quite seem to add up. But that's just because he missed so much of his prime. So yeah, he was amazing. What can you say?
Yeah, he doesn't come up. I think he doesn't come up often enough when people talk about the greatest pitchers ever. And he doesn't come up when, you hear a lot about how Ted Williams and DiMaggio, guys like that, lost, years of their prime to the war. But Feller isn't often included in that conversation, and that's a shame.
Well, I think that, like, the interesting thing is that if you look at sort of the newspapers and the magazines at the time that Feller is there, which would coincide with the primes of Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio, they're talking about in the same breath. It's sort of Williams, DiMaggio, and Feller are the big ones. You might add Stan Musial in there as well. Like, those are the sorts of superstars of the time. And Williams and DiMaggio held either their mystique or their iconic status through the decades, and Feller lost his. And I think there are a variety of reasons for it, one of which is what we've talked about, Feller's sort of continuing ability to say insensitive things about either black players or executives. He had a longstanding feud with Jackie Robinson. He also became a little bit cantankerous later in his life, and would say things in interviews that were perhaps a little misguided. But yeah, the sheen went off of his star in a way that it didn't with DiMaggio and Williams, and that is too bad, because I think he was right up there with them, and I think that early in his career he outshone them.
Right. So moving on to another of the main characters in your book, we have Larry Doby. And I think I enjoyed reading about him and his storyline most of any of the characters in the book. In large part because I knew the least about him. But as you touched on it, kind of at the beginning of our conversation, it presented this kind of alternative narrative to the Jackie Robinson story. The way we talk about Jackie, I think there are a lot of people who would think that kind of, he broke the color line and there wasn't another African-American player in the league for another 5 years or something, that he carried this burden all by himself for a long time. And that's kind of the myth. But of course, Larry Doby joined the major leagues just a few months after Jackie. Was the first and only player for a while in the American League, and of course faced a lot of the the same challenges and obstacles and hatred, frankly, um, that Jackie faced. He he took a little bit different journey to the major leagues. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his how he broke into the league.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you touched upon there, there's the way that we tell the story about Major League integration is so centered on one individual that it can either give the impression that this individual had to sort of suffer in solitude for a long time before others joined him, or that because Jackie Robinson sort of made it into the major leagues and immediately became pretty successful, that it became easier for the other people that followed him, and that simply is not the case. And I think it also sort of shows that there were many different ways of integrating that were happening at the same time. And if Branch Rickey hadn't done it, Bill Veeck was going to do it anyway. Larry Doby was somebody who came from Paterson, New Jersey. He was a tremendous high school athlete, so much so that Paterson held a big banquet for him when he graduated. He went into the Negro Leagues. He also went into the Navy, which was segregated and which really sort of was his first sort of big brush with state-sanctioned segregation. It really wounded him. But he was on the Newark Eagles, which was a tremendous team. They ended up winning the 1946 Negro League World Series. He was tearing up the league in 47. And so Veeck had his eye on him, but he did not want to integrate the way that Branch Rickey did, which was to sign Jackie Robinson in late 1945, send him down to the minors, give everybody time to acclimate, allow sort of Robinson to sort of, tiptoe his way through the system before he finally integrates the Dodgers 18 months later. Veeck just wanted it to happen really quickly. He thought that sort of putting Dovey into the minor leagues would put too much pressure on him. He just thinks it's almost like a Band-Aid. You just rip it off and get it over with. And so that's literally what happened. Larry Doby played one last game for the Newark Eagles on July 4th, 1947. He boarded a train to Chicago where the Indians were playing the White Sox, and the very next day he was in the major leagues. He traveled literally overnight to the majors, and it was a tremendous shock. His teammates also didn't know that this was going to happen, and so they treated him very coldly. Some of them didn't shake his hand. They didn't want to sort of warm up with him. Doby said that he was so nervous and sort of in shock by the rapidity of this that the first 10 times or so he came to the plate, his teeth were chattering and he couldn't get them to stop. I mean, it was very different than what Robinson had to go through.
What was the reception among the people of Cleveland? I primarily the white people, the white fan base in Cleveland to Doby's arrival.
Well, it's kind of complicated because in 1947, Doby comes in July of 1947, and a lot of the newspapers are saying, well, if he proves that he's major league worthy, then we're going to accept him. A lot of people were skeptical. They weren't certain if this was kind of a stunt that Bill Veeck was doing in order to draw more fans. Bill Veeck was notorious for promotions that would draw people to the ballpark. Other people, I mean, particularly among the players, they felt that Doby had not earned his right to be there yet. They did not consider the Negro Leagues to be in the same class as the major leagues. These are the white players. So they thought that they had gone through the minor league system, everybody except for Bob Feller, and that they had sort of worked their way up to the majors. And here's Doby just sort of waltzing into the majors. He hadn't earned his right to do that. There was one player, Eddie Robinson, who whenever Doby was announced that he was going to start in Eddie Robinson's position, which was first base, this would have been Doby's second game with the Indians, Eddie Robinson quit the team. He just said, I think this is unfair. I'm trying to sort of get my position in the majors, and here's this person who just comes in here with just right from the Negro Leagues and is taking playing time away from me. there was this fear among white players that integration would mean a lack of standing and playing time for them. And so the manager of the team, Lou Boudreau, was in a real spot. He could sense that there could be a mutiny that could build if Larry Doby was taking playing time away from these individuals. And so Doby really just didn't play a lot in 1947. He only started one game. He was mainly used as a pinch hitter. He was nervous. He didn't get any time to sort of settle into a rhythm or anything like that. So a lot of fans really thought that Doby wasn't major league worthy and that Bill Veeck had made a big mistake by doing what he did. So the reception wasn't necessarily tremendously hostile in Cleveland. It was just, he's not a ball player.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football is back, and the best bet you can make is downloading the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It doesn't matter if you're new to gambling or an old pro, FanDuel has something for everyone. And as an official sports betting partner of the NFL, you know your bets are safe. There's also never been a better time to use FanDuel, because right now, you'll get up to $1,000 back if your first bet doesn't win. You can even turn a small wager into a big payday with a same-game parlay bet. Just sign up with the promo code Spotify to place your first bet risk-free on FanDuel Sportsbook. Download FanDuel today. 21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
This episode is brought to you by HP Plus. In a world full of smart devices, shouldn't your printer be smart too? It is with HP Plus. These printers know when they're running low, so you always get the ink you need delivered right when you need it. Plus, you save up to 50% on ink, so you can print whatever you want, as much as you want, anytime you want. Huh, that is pretty smart. Get 6 free months of instant ink when you choose HP Plus. Conditions apply. Visit hp.com/smart for details.
And that brings us to the fourth major character of the book, Bill Veeck, and you talked a little bit about him. He was certainly a character and really revolutionary in the way he tried different ways to bring people to the ballpark. Could you talk a little bit about him and his personality?
Yeah, Veeck was born in Chicago basically into baseball. His father was the president of the Chicago Cubs. He grew up around the ballpark. He learned a lot about how to run a team by the time he was basically 18. He had a tremendous head start on a lot of people. And he got into the Cubs organization, but where he really made his mark was whenever he bought the Milwaukee Brewers as a very young man. I think he was 27. And the Milwaukee Brewers were still a minor league team at this point. And Veeck really then sort of started to experiment. He believed that at the time, baseball was a little bit too staid and not as entertaining as it could be. He thought that competitive play on the field could coexist with sort of entertaining sideshows before and between innings. And so he didn't think that took away from the dignity of the game. He thought that it could bring out people who were not sort of already big baseball fans because they would come to see the fireworks or the sideshows or whatever. And then they would stay and they would watch the game and they would actually then become fans. And so he really thought that like you could build a bigger base by doing this. A lot of executives at the time thought that this was like circus stuff, that it was taking away from the dignity of the great American pastime and all those sort of things. In fact, just didn't have any time for them. He was somebody who was very ahead of his time. Even the way he looked, he didn't wear a hat, he didn't wear a tie, he didn't wear a suit jacket. This was at a time whenever owners wore three-piece suits to the ballpark. I mean, he looks so different than all of them, and he was just a sort of a whirlwind personality. He rarely slept. He was out giving speeches all the time. He was doing anything he could to promote his team, and he was also basically acting as his own GM. And so he was putting together rosters, and he had extraordinary baseball instincts. I mean, he takes Cleveland from a sixth-place club in 1946 to a championship in 1948. I mean, he just completely turns around the club within 2 years. And so he has this sort of incredible combination of skills and a personality that just excites anybody that he's with. He's almost like the Pied Piper. He can sort of just get you to follow him.
Was there any precedent for, some of the things that he was doing? Like, where did he come up with these techniques? Did he have a mentor? Was there anyone doing these things at all? Fireworks, giveaways, that kind of stuff? Or did he just come up with all that on his own?
There was more experimentation in the minor leagues than there was in the major leagues. I believe that there was an owner whose name is escaping me in Tennessee who was doing stuff like this as well. And so it wasn't like he was wholly original. There was a show on Broadway that was extremely popular at this time. It was called Hell's a Poppin'. And it was also a movie made in the 30s and 40s, but it was an unpredictable show that involved the audience. And so they would do things like do raffles during the Broadway show, and the winner got like a big block of ice or like a chicken or something like this. And it was funny then to just sort of watch this person in the audience have to wrestle with the chicken for the rest of the show. That's sort of, it was kind of an anarchic, almost like Marx Brothers energy to it. And Vec was very inspired by that. He would give away wild promotions, like he would give people cows and pigs and, doves and other sorts of things that then they would have to figure out what to do with during the game. And so there was just kind of, it had an anarchic energy to it. He calmed down a little bit by the time he got to Cleveland, but he hired clowns as first base coaches. He had a stuntman literally on the roster of the Indians. And before games, this guy would drive around in a Jeep on the outfield and shag flies. He just had this energy about him that was so different than the way that a Major League Baseball game would have felt at that time, that like people didn't really know what to make of him. But now I think that all these things you see at Major League Parks now, whether it's cap dances or mascots or T-shirt cannons or whatever, that's all inspired by Vec. Like everything that you see there, the fingerprints of Bill Vec is all over the modern stadium.
So as you touched upon, Dobie's, his initial transition to major leagues was difficult. The 47 season was difficult. But he really put it together in 48 after struggling a little at the start of the season, but then kind of midway through the season, he became a mainstay in the lineup and a very important piece of that club. And that summer, Vec went ahead and signed Satchel Paige. And that was a surprise, of course, because the prevailing thinking was to acquire young black players who you could teach and mold and had time to learn the major league game. And I guess another factor would be that, the younger players didn't come with as big a price tag as a Satchel Paige did. But how did he finally get his shot?
Yeah, it's interesting. So basically in 1946 and 1947, Bill Vec is quoted in newspapers constantly as saying the Indians are weak in the outfield and weak in pitching. And how is he going to turn that around? This is, of course, an era before free agency, whenever you could just kind of go out and sign people. You had to either do it through trades or through drafting, things like that. But Vec had this other idea of going into the Negro Leagues, of course. And Larry Doby at first looked like somebody who was a bust and wasn't going to make it. They shift him into the outfield in 1948, and he just kind of has this miraculous turnaround. He just tears up spring training. He makes it onto the Indians roster, and he becomes the outfielder that the Indians needed. Pitching in 1948 continued to be a problem, particularly because Bob Feller was having a very subpar season. Bob Feller was under 500 by the All-Star break, which was unheard of. And so Vec needed something fast because the Indians were in an extremely tight pennant race. He had seen Satchel Paige pitch as early as the early 1930s, and he had always kind of had it in the back of his mind that, if only I could get somebody like Satchel Paige. He didn't want to do it in 1946 whenever he first buys the Indians because, as you said, Satchel Paige was already in his 40s by this time. And so it would certainly be interpreted as a promotion or a stunt if Vec signed Satchel Paige during a year when the Indians were no good. But in 1948, the Indians were good, and they were in a tremendous pennant race. And Vec thought that they needed pitching reinforcements, and so it was finally time to get Satchel Paige onto the roster. That didn't prevent people from saying that, oh, you're doing this just to bring in more people, you're trying to set attendance records and all this, but Vec was adamant. He knew what Satchel Paige could do. He thought he still had enough in him to make a contribution. And it didn't hurt the fact that Satchel Paige was, somewhat of a showman and somebody that could draw people to the park. That certainly, I think that Vec and Paige had very similar personalities, but Vec did this purely for competitive reasons. He was looking to see the best pitcher out there, and it happened to be Paige.
So, you touch in the book about how you touch on some of the struggles that Doby had, being the lone black player on the team and the prejudice he faced and having to stay in different hotels and things of that nature. And of course, the loneliness that comes with that kind of life. And so one would think that Satchel joining the team would be a real boon for Doby, but it wasn't that simple, as you talked about. How did the two of them get along?
They didn't get along well. As you mentioned, Larry Doby, one of the primary problems, besides obviously prejudices and sort of lack of playing time, was that he was alone so much. He could not stay in a lot of the same hotels as the Indians players, and even whenever he did not have a roommate, which was the custom at the time, because there was no custom of a white player rooming with a black player. He was the lone black player on the Indians for more than a year, and so he would sort of have a bad game and then just have to go back and just sort of stew in, the bad feelings that he had. He wasn't able to sort of have a beer with people and sort of, forget about it or something like that. And so the alienation and the loneliness really dragged on Doby. And he talked in many interviews about wanting another black player there that he could sort of talk through these burdens and challenges that he was facing as a pioneer. What he got instead was Satchel Paige, who was 17 years older. So the way I always think of it is, imagine if like your dad suddenly becomes your roommate. I mean, Satchel Paige was old enough to be Doby's dad. But I think more significantly, Satchel Paige and Larry Doby came from very different generations. Larry Doby was somebody who was always endeavoring to be what he said all the time as dignified on the field. He carried himself in interviews on and off the field as a way to sort of, show that sort of dignity and pride and everything like that. That was very important to him. Satchel Paige came from a generation where he had developed a persona that some people could see traces of the comic persona Step and Fetch It in, the sort of slow walk, the deadpan look, even the way he talked. And so, he was more of he was into sort of joking with reporters and teammates. He had elaborate wind-ups, things like this. A lot of white papers called Satchel Paige a clown. unfairly, of course, because Page was anything but that. And Dobie thought that sort of persona was detrimental to what he was trying to establish as how a black player acted and held himself and things like that. And so he was constantly trying to get Satchel Paige to get it, to change. But Page was in his 40s and he'd made it that far. He wasn't going to change. So these two did not have sort of similar philosophical worldviews.
Lou Boudreau was the star player / manager of the 47-48 Indians. How is his relationship with Dobie and Page, and how important was he to making that experiment, for lack of a better word, of integration work within the Indians?
I think his relationship was okay. Lou Boudreau was somebody who joined the Indians when he was 23, and within a year, he's basically made player manager. He becomes the manager of the Indians at age 24, while he's still the shortstop. There are many reasons for that, but he holds that position through the war. And whenever Bill Veeck buys the team, he does not think highly of Boudreau as a manager. He loves him as a shortstop, does not love him as a manager, thinks that he's somebody who just kind of manages from his gut. He doesn't have a lot of strategy. He's not kind of like, I guess, a sabermetrical guy, as we would now say it. And Veeck wanted more of a tactician. But Boudreau made it clear to Veeck that if Veeck took away his managing things, and he'd often have to take away his shortstop, he would not play for the Indians if he could not also manage the Indians. So Veeck was in a bind. Veeck did not want to lose Boudreau as a shortstop, even though he tried at the end of the 1947 season. But the town revolted. They loved Lou Boudreau. He was so popular in Cleveland. So Veeck was kind of stuck with him as a manager. And Boudreau was trying to prove to Bill Veeck that he could be a great manager. And he was also trying to hold the clubhouse together while also being a player. And so with Dobie and Page, he was kind of in a bind because he couldn't sort of alienate the white players that maybe didn't think so highly of integration. And he also was just so interested in trying to hold on to his position that he didn't perhaps give Dobie the support that he would have needed at that time. And with Page, Boudreau was just kind of frustrated with him because Page often was late for things. Sometimes he didn't even show up to the ballpark if it was raining because he was like, figure there wasn't going to be a game anyway. Page just had his own schedule, and Boudreau got frustrated with that. So, I mean, you can understand why, but I'm not sure that either Page or Boudreau or Page or Dobie would have had a lot of high words for him.
Of course, the Indians went on to win the World Series that year in 1948. And there's this wonderful anecdote that you share in there towards the end of that season about Bob Feller using Bob Feller's telescope from World War II to steal signs. And of course, that was interesting within the context of the recent sign stealing scandal with the Astros. I wonder how common was that type of thing in baseball at that time?
I mean, it was pretty common. You can look at the sort of 1951 Giants as a team that stole signs, most famously whenever Bobby Thompson hit his shot heard around the world. And it was so common that ball players would devise systems where they were trying to throw off the sign stealers by, switching signs or having the pitcher call the signs or anything like that. For the Indians' case, Bob Feller went to war. He was in the Navy. He had a military-grade telescope that he was able to keep when he came back. So the municipal stadium where the Indians played was this giant coliseum of a ballpark, 78,000 people it could hold. So center field was very far away from the plate, and they would station a pitcher who was not pitching that day, sometimes Feller, sometimes Bob Lemon, in there and point the telescope at the catcher's fingers and then sort of either like put an arm outside of one of the boxes in the manual scoreboard or just kind of do some gestures so the batter could sort of look straight ahead and see what was coming. The Indians played a tremendous amount of games at home in September of 1948, and they had a tremendous winning record. I think that sign stealing had a lot to do with that.
Fascinating. Um, so of course the Indians won the World Series, and Doby and Page were instrumental on that team. Page not so much in the series itself, but he had there was a period late in the season where he was crucial to the Indian success, and then Doby was perhaps their best player in the World Series. One would think that would have opened the floodgates for black players in the major leagues, but of course that wasn't the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, the subtitle of my book was the ending of it is the World Series that changed baseball. And in some way, that might be a little bit misleading because it should have changed baseball. Like, the Indians hadn't won the World Series since 1920. They hadn't been in the World Series since 1920. They'd spent sort of 28 years up until that point trying to get past the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Tigers. They could never get over the hump. They were never terrible. They were always just kind of in the mix, but they couldn't take it to that ultimate level they needed to do. And it's what Bill Veeck does when he comes in in addition to various trades that he makes, he integrates the team. And as you said, Satchel Paige had 6 crucial wins down the stretch of 1948. Without those wins, the Indians do not make the World Series. And Larry Doby morphs into a superstar, without which the Indians definitely would not have made the World Series, and they wouldn't have won the World Series without Larry Doby. And so basically, not only what Veeck is doing is he's not only showing you how to draw more people to the ballpark, he's giving teams a blueprint for getting past the big hitters. And the blueprint is simple. You integrate. You take you can sign good players from the Negro leagues, and then you can sort of plug in whatever you need. Your weakness. I mean, as I said, the Indians' weakness was pitching in the outfield. Veeck plugged those in and ends up winning the World Series. And so that really could have been the blueprint for other teams. But of course, prejudice and conservative and traditionalism and things like that run deep in Major League Baseball. And so by the time the 1949 season opens, no other team has followed Veeck's lead.
Why do you think Doby doesn't receive more recognition today? Is it as simple as him not being the first, Jackie being the first, and that narrative just taking off, or is there more to that?
I think that's a huge reason. I think that the second person to do anything becomes the answer to a trivia question. I think that Doby's career, at the end of 1948, whenever Doby wins the World Series for the Indians and is sort of heralded as this up-and-coming superstar, Bill Veeck really thought he was going to be better than Stan Musial. There was this idea that Doby was going to be much better than Jackie Robinson. He was younger than Robinson. He had this tremendous future ahead of him. And he just kind of has an uneven career. He's up some years, he's down some years. And I think a lot of people sort of interpreted that as Doby being in his head, as Doby being perhaps too introverted and sensitive and all these other things that prevented him from unlocking his greatness. Even Bill Veeck thought that. But I think that we discounted all of the burdens and the sort of prejudices and the hostility that Doby had to go through that really took its toll on him mentally and emotionally, and that caused this sort of uneven career. I think that for a long time people didn't recognize that. And also, Doby himself is just a much quieter individual. I mean, out of the 4 people that my book focuses on, Veeck, Page, and Feller all wrote more than one autobiography. They're sort of telling their life story constantly. It's kind of almost like a form of currency for these people. Doby never wrote an autobiography, which is shocking. He should have. But he was a reticent man. He did not like interviews. He was a very tough man to get to know. He was certainly the hardest figure for me to research.
That being said, there may not be a great answer to this follow-up question, but when you hear a lot of old-time black athletes talk about their experiences, there's often a bitterness in their tone. And I say that without any judgment at all. I'm thinking of guys like Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, and not just in baseball. Bill Russell has it. I would say Oscar Robertson has it. There's a bitterness because of all that they had to endure because of the color of their skin. Do you have any concept of how Doby looked back on his role in integration and his experience in the major leagues?
Yeah, I think bitterness is a good way to describe it. There is a writer for the New York Star Ledger named Jerry Eisenberg who,
Sure, I'm familiar with him.
yeah, lived next to Doby in Montclair, New Jersey for a long time, and he said that Doby would come over to his house basically to unload. He almost sort of treated Jerry as a therapist, and at one point Jerry told him, "Doby, or Larry, you are the bitterest ex-athlete I've ever interviewed." I think that those slights really added up to Doby, and you could say the same thing about Satchel Paige. The one interesting thing, this obviously isn't in the book because it takes place after the book, but Satchel Paige published his autobiography, Maybe I'll Pitch Forever, in the mid to late 60s. And at that time, Bill Veeck was out of baseball. And one of the things that he was doing during this sort of little retirement of his was writing a lot for the newspapers. And so they had Bill Veeck review Satchel Paige's autobiography, and it sort of went across the wire in many newspapers. And one of the things that Bill Veeck said was that he was surprised at how bitter the autobiography is. He's like, this is not the Satchel Paige that I know. I don't know if the ghostwriter did this, but this is not what I recognize when I think of Satchel Paige. And I think that even Bill Veeck, who was lifelong friends with Paige and who really, helped Paige a lot over his career, didn't see the bitterness that was there, or perhaps chose not to, or whatever. But it was a really interesting statement from Veeck that he couldn't see that bitterness. But yeah, you read Satchel Paige's autobiography, and here's somebody who continues to be a folk hero, and he's very bitter in certain places about it.
Yeah. Let me just say once again, the name of Luke's book is Our Town, the epic story of four men and the World Series that changed baseball. I loved it. I mean, it's just, if you're a baseball fan, you'll eat it up, but you don't need to be a baseball fan. It just, it's composed of and based around these four fascinating characters, which really drives it. And so I really recommend it. I want to ask you one last question, Luke, that I ask all my guests, and that is, what is your all-time favorite sports book?
Oh man, gosh, that's a tough question. I really like the sports writing of David Halberstam, and so the two books that flash to mind are The Breaks of the Game, which is his fantastic book about the Portland Trailblazers in the late 1970s, and October 1964. I guess I'm going to go with October 1964 because it has a lot of similarities to my book. This is about the St. Louis Cardinals, my beloved team, and the New York Yankees in 1964. The St. Louis Cardinals had been pretty bad through the 50s, and then they decide to integrate, and they bring on these amazing players, Bob Gibson, Lou Brock, Curt Flood, and it really sort of propels them back into the pennant race. And the Yankees, who had won a ton of championships through the 50s with very minimal and sort of conservative integration that they'd done, had all these aging white superstars by the time 64 comes around, and no sort of black players in their farm system ready to replace them. And so you saw it's kind of a similar theme to my book, that the teams that integrated and really embraced it started to outrun the teams that were a little bit more skeptical of it.
Right. I've read Breaks of the Game, obviously phenomenal book. I'll have to check out October 1964.
Yeah.
All right, Luke. Well, thank you so much for coming in and talking about your book. I wish you the best of luck with it, and take care.
All right. Thank you.